Hello, good people of the internet and of the world. We are here today with another great episode for you with the chairmans of board. Chairman, I guess chairman's already plural, so you don't need to add an S to that, do you? I'm here with the great Brian Omilion, the great Grant Klassen of Goodwood Audio and Omilion Audio, respectively. And today we have an interesting topic, which I think is something that has always seemed to be a hot button discussion, which is the idea of modern versus vintage, or even not just necessarily that we're talking about what's the Strandberg or something like that versus a vintage Strat, but more like reissues. Like, is there an issue with a TS9 built in 2024 versus a TS9 built in the mid 80s, or a TS808 built in 2024 versus a TS808 made in 1979? There's a lot of very strong opinions about the degree to which a product's vintage informs its quality, its integrity of sound. And we're going to unpack this today. We're going to unpack this as far as amplifiers are concerned. We're going to unpack this as far as pedals are concerned. And to a degree, also guitars, our instrument of choice collectively. Before we jump off into this, just so the audience, the listener, kind of has a sense of where we may be coming from as individuals, Brian, could you kind of give us a quick overview of kind of where you are in terms of your position around modern versus vintage? Are you anti-vintage or are you Uncle Vintage?
I guess I could say the fun uncle kind of a vintage in a way, where
that you get drunk at the Thanksgiving party and jump into
that guy.
I mean, if I didn't have kids, yeah. But yeah, I think there is a kind of like a line when it comes to vintage and modern, because I think so many people, and I've seen this time and time again, people will in a way obsess over has to be vintage. You know, these have to be battery powered. They have to be this. Like, there's all these things, all these aspects that sometimes those types, like every overdrive on your board has to be a 9-volt battery or whatever, like that kind of thing. And sometimes it can get you into trouble when you're playing in all 9 pedals die at the same time. And there's just a lot of extra stuff that you have to kind of like redundancies you got to think about. So I think there is a fine line between like having a couple vintage and then having a lot of modern pedals. So I don't think it's a hard no and a hard like yes. Like, I think there is a line of kind of like a compilation, I guess, or a combination of each that complement each other as well as make things fun. Because when it comes down to it, and I've always said this, is like those, you could have a Klon. You literally have a Klon, Mason, in one of your cases behind you. I remember when we were visiting and I was talking about it.
It's just sitting in a Tupperware container.
Literally just sitting in a Tupperware container. And I was like, oh, this is, thousands of dollars of a Klon. And the thing is something like that, hearing that Klon is amazing and it sounds wonderful, but nowadays people coming out with Klon clones like J Rocket and all these guys that have done this kind of stuff, and they sound really great. And it's the crazy, and I'll end because this is not brief at all, obviously, but like sometimes like even the people in the audience or the crowd or whatever, they don't know the difference between your $10,000 $5,000 Klon and your $200 reissue pedal. So I think there is a fine level, and also just we're all kind of hobbyists when it comes to that kind of stuff. I think that's more of like a collector's thing. So that's my quick thought on it.
I'd probably be somewhere similar in the fact that I think having vintage gear is really cool, getting to own a piece of history, especially a piece of history in an industry that we are all very fond of. I would challenge a lot, not for every piece of gear out there, but for a lot of gear, if people are making a vintage purchase strictly based on what they think sounds better, I would tend to challenge that, especially when it comes to pedals. But I don't discount the fact that sometimes it's nice to own a piece of gear that was, an innovator at its time. And it's cool to see how that evolved and to own that piece of history. But I don't personally go out looking for vintage gear because of the sound. I would go out looking for stuff if I was to make a purchase more based on what it represents for the history of what we're all involved in. As a broad brush answer, we can get into more specifics, obviously, later in the episode. But that's kind of where I would sit. Is it's just cool to look back and see where we came from in essence. Yeah. And I will say one other point to what Brian was saying. I also don't discount the fact that the audience, I agree 100%, the audience is not going to tell the difference between your Klon and the Archer Klon clone, which sounds amazing. No one in the audience is going to know. But if you psychologically think that it sounds better, it will probably affect how you play, and that might make a difference. But how you measure that, I don't think you really can. But I think there is a psychological component to it as well.
How many feet of tone is a real Klon versus a reissue? Measure it.
How do we measure this thing? And so, so I think how you play and how you approach your instrument is affected by the gear that you play. Even if you were blindfolded and had no idea, that might disappear. But that's not how we play our instruments. So
it's 10 pounds more of tone.
At least, I would say. But I would probably measure it in kilograms. So we're looking at 4.4 kilos here of difference for sure. Yeah. That's my hot take.
What about you, Mason?
Well, my opinion has been, and I think maybe we start with the category of pedals, since it's kind of where we're mostly living between the three of us, and then maybe we migrate to amps and guitars following that. I'm pretty much of the attitude that if there's an opportunity to collect, and then again, this is speaking for me personally, this is not speaking for anybody else. If there's a good deal to be had on a vintage piece of gear, let's say around pedals, that I'm as interested in the next guy at picking up an 80s Tube Screamer for $200, $300. And to me, the incremental difference between a reissue and that for a few $100s, it's cool. That's not to say that every vintage Tube Screamer that I have, and I have a few, is necessarily any better than another one. And I've used fairly extensively a mini Tube Screamer on one of my rigs, and have found it to be able to fulfill the same duties as any other Tube Screamer that I have. Like maybe the knobs aren't quite in the same position, but the sonic characteristic of what it does is very much the same as what I would expect from any of the other Tube Screamers that I have. And for things like the Klon, like if I didn't have that already, I wouldn't feel any obligation or desire. Yeah. I know I'm saying this not in that situation, but I don't feel any need to buy one. I also have a Rocket Archer, and I usually end up using that more often, mostly because on most pedal boards that I would build, to make that accommodation for something the size of a Klon, it's just not practical in the world of pedal boards in 2024. And it's not even that I'm trying to preserve it or I don't want to use it or anything like that. When I bought that pedal, I think I paid $250 for it. I'm pretty sure.
You jerk.
It was definitely less than $300. I remember that I bought it in near Oakland here, where I live, in a city called Alameda, which is just like kind of like an island that's kind of off of Oakland. And I remember this guy lived on one of these canals. It kind of has like a similar vibe to Venice Beach, where there's these canals. And I remember buying it from this guy, and it was probably like, I'm trying to think what year that was. It was probably like 2008, maybe something around there. And it's great. There's nothing wrong with it, but to kind of take it back to a more macro view of the pedal thing. Obviously, if we're talking about reissues versus originals, this doesn't apply to everything. Most pedals have to reach a certain level in the pedal world, in the culture of pedals, to even be a consideration for a reissue. So you're not going to see just old pedals reissued without reason. You're going to see the big guys, the fuzz face, the tube screamer, the Dynacomp, these sorts of things that have created the Memory Man, another example. You're going to see things that have become staples in the kind of the culture of guitar players and guitar pedals get reissued because there's so much interest in them still, even 30 or 40 years later, that there's a viable marketplace for them to continue to exist. A recent one that has actually been somewhat controversial, as I've come to understand, are the Vox wah pedals. The Vox is reissued a quality, allegedly 1-to-1 replica of the V8, what is it, the 846, something like that. I forget the number in a Clyde McCoy, and apparently some wah makers are very upset about this, and then others that are I think very esteemed in what they do and really just focus exclusively on doing wah pedals have said, it's about as good of a build as you could do in a mass production context. I think that for the most part, when it comes to reissues, there's always something that's missing in terms of pedals, and often that's because the way that pedals are built now versus when the originals were made, if we're talking about 70s or 80s, it's just not the same. Like there's not a lot of companies that are making pedals like that, or even have the right infrastructure to build a pedal exactly the same. But what they do have is the ability to probably make the pedal more competitively priced than it would be if they made it in the style that it used to be. And hopefully they have the engineering skills in their staff to be able to replicate the important things that represent the sound the same way that it was back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think that in the world of pedals, again, just talking about pedals, I think that it's probably the easiest comparatively to other electronic instruments, like comparatively to amplifiers. I think it's a lot easier to get there in pedals because I think that the quality of the parts generally have gotten better, have gotten quieter, and the technology to manufacture has gotten better and more efficient. So I think you can generally make quieter, more efficient, more consistent versions, again, if you know what you're doing and you've hired the right people in order to make the implementation. And I think it's something that goes back to something that John Suhr had told me many years ago when we had talked to him about this idea of PCB versus hand wired as it relates to tube amps. And he said, it's not the method, it's the implementation. So if you have an issue with the way that surface mount components might work, or you have an issue with that it's not hand wired, and most pedals weren't hand wired. There were some, but most were not. And the main thing is just understanding that if there is an issue or there is a discrepancy, that it's not related to the fact that it was on a PCB or it was surface mount or whatever it was. And there are some parts that don't exist anymore in surface mount or don't exist yet in surface mount. And they would still be through hole, in companies that are making those devices where those are required, they probably would still use them. And that's typically what I see. I don't see them typically doing a workaround to kind of get there. They try to, when there is a place where it requires a carbon comp, or that's what was in there, or whatever it is, they'll use a full size through hole component, and they'll do it the way that it was done in the originals. But I don't have much problem with it. I think that the problem is that some companies do it poorly, with poor execution of a reissue, and then it kind of gives other reissues a bad name because of it. And it's not because anything else is wrong with it. And again, I think that this really, to me, only applies to the biggest of pedals, the most popular of pedals, because that's usually the only place that you're going to see a reissue. Again, in the kind of like the Tube Screamer, Dynacomp, Memory Mans, we've seen this, Fuzz Faces, we've seen this. And Fuzz Faces, they're using transistors. I think that one might be harder to pull off. But again, in the old days, a lot of this stuff was not as well built as people remember. And even if you took did a comparison of multiple tube screamers from 1979 to 1981, you would get a lot of variance between all of them, and they would all sound a little different from each other. I would argue that if you bought a TS-808 reissue now, it's going to sound as different as any of them sounded to each other back then. I would say, though, if you grabbed a bunch of new ones, reissues, they would all sound much closer to each other than the old ones would sound to each other, because they're just more consistent. But I'll pass it off to one of you on as it relates to reissue pedals versus the vintage originals, and maybe you can dive in a little deeper.
Well, I think the thing that I really my opinion on the pedal side specifically is, let's say chipsets being equal. So a lot of times the reissues, maybe the chips aren't available that were originally put in the pedal, so they have to find some sort of close approximation. But let's say chipsets are the same. I don't know why, again, if it's been done well, like you were saying, Mason, I don't know why, tonally speaking, just talking sound that comes out of the pedal, you would, for the most part, why you would choose the vintage version over the newer version, because chances are you're going to get, and I know some people have very strong opinions on this, and please disagree if you disagree, but you're going to get a lower noise floor, tighter tolerances, smoother sweeps on pots, more control often. There's just everything, as we tend to talk about, a little bit of a broad brush again here, but as we tend to talk about it as guitar players, the new versus the old is just going to be better. As far as, like I was saying, noise floor, it'll typically last longer, better components, all that type of thing, just because we have the technology now that wasn't available back then. And then again, just to reiterate your point, maybe this newer pedal eventually goes down. The reissue that you buy to replace the reissue that you bought is going to sound basically the same. Whereas you do that with the vintage stuff, it just won't. Or it's going to have a much lower likelihood of being in that neighborhood. And then you might get that, replacement to a vintage version. Like this, it doesn't have the magic that my old one did. Or, man, this one sounds way better than the vintage one I thought I loved. Mm-hmm. And you just can't replicate it across, pedal to pedal. So ease of access, price points, similar sound on the reissues, by and large, again, a few things being equal, I don't know why. Like, if you love the vintage one, buy it, keep it on your shelf, and then buy the reissue and use that for the sake of consistency and sound and accessibility on your touring rig, maybe, and so I think strictly from a tonal point of view, that's where I would generally sit when it comes to the pedal side of things. I personally have zero issue, in fact, I prefer SMT pedals for all the reasons that we just talked about. And I just think it makes a whole lot more sense as far as a reliable piece of gear. And, sorry, you go, Brian.
I was just gonna say, can you quickly explain what SMT is? Just for listeners that might not know.
Yeah, so there's, you have a circuit board. Let's say even some of the vintage pedals, they were made on like a perf board, which is basically a fiberglass square for let's say a fuzz face, a fiberglass square. And you can manually solder components together in the way that they need to, according to the schematic, on this perf board. There's also point to point, which, what's the company that does it? He was on that pedal show. Is it it's not Revelation. It's, I'm blanking on the name, but he does all basically like point to point. And so you see like silver exposed bus wire, which is just like a wire that you solder from point to component, and it's just floating in an enclosure. Like that's another way that would be kind of maybe a more old school way of doing it. And then you have SMT, which are surface mount components, and a computer essentially places those on the board with some solder paste. It's very precise. The components are usually tighter tolerances, so there's less variance from component to component. And then it gets put in an oven, and it's soldered that way on an oven. So you don't have the error rates of someone missing a solder joint if they were doing it all by hand, which absolutely happens. And you don't have the higher tolerances and the failure rates on these parts. Everything is on one circuit board, a PCB, and then everything is placed by a computer. And oftentimes it's mixed. So you'll have 90% of it as SMT components. And like Mason was saying, a chip isn't available in SMT. It can't be placed by a computer. It has to be placed by hand. And the legs go straight through the circuit board and they're soldered, or it's socketed. And so you can easily remove that from a socket that is placed on the PCB. But like there's, for all the people that are saying the hand-wired stuff is better, you have a really hard case to make. And I'd be curious what that case is.
Yeah, there's so many more. There's a lot more failures. Definitely,
so many more
hand-wired stuff.
failure points.
In the issue too, and I'll just say this really quickly before Brian jumps in, is that there can be a lot of variability in lead length, especially if you're dealing with a lot of hand-wired stuff. Because in certain stages, especially when you're dealing with overdrive pedals, certain stages may be sensitive to how long those leads are. And so if you have, if one person on the assembly line is cutting that lead to 6 inches and another person is cutting it to 3, that's going to make a tremendous difference in the pedal, depending on the circuit, depending on the location of this wire in the circuit. There can be things that really affect how things sound and the final product. And so this is why with the surface mount stuff, again, done right, we're not talking about bad implementation doesn't mean the method is bad. That you can get really consistent. Like if you know what your target is and you have a good engineer that's on your team, you can nail it. You can really nail it and deliver a really high quality product that sounds great, and everyone is within a small fraction of margin from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's where, I think I'm still such an advocate. I'm still such an advocate for the blindfold test of just get the vintage TS9 in this example and a reissue TS9, turn around, get your buddy to A/B them back and forth.
Pepsi challenge.
And just see what happens. Like see firstly, if you can tell the difference. And secondly, which one you like better when you don't have the bias of looking at what you're playing, because it's a big bias and we're all susceptible to it. We all like the real Klon more than the $50 Chinese knockoff until we turn around like, I actually can't tell the difference when I'm not looking at it. It's a little confronting, to be so convinced. But again, I will say, if you don't play blindfolded, and if you play differently when you have the real Klon on your board, put the real Klon on your board. I don't care. But don't make the argument that they're vastly different if you're not factoring in the psychological side of things as well, because I just don't think that really exists with pedals to the degree that we think it does, if we're being totally honest. And I've been, to my own embarrassment, I have absolutely been susceptible to this as well, where I see people playing a real Klon or a real deluxe memory man, like, oh, it's so warm and smooth. And then they pull the wool off. It's like, oh yeah, that was just a cheap digital model of it that was just
was a
modeled off the
Behringer.
original. And it's exactly, he's like, well, now I feel like a total idiot. But then it makes the case, well, I'll just get the cheap one and put it on my board, and you can buy backups of it all day long because they're under $100 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so I love owning the originals, but I think it's really hard to make a case on a tonal stance that the originals are better in some cases, or maybe even the majority of cases.
Yeah, I remember when Bill Finnegan, when he maybe it was a year or two ago, he released a thing saying that he was doing an updated version of the KTR. I think he was removing the battery cable, and he couldn't get a certain resistor, so he was changing it. So I remember driving into work, and when I started getting some text messages about it, and I was just like, oh, wait, what is going on? And someone's like, Bill Finnegan's changing the KTR or whatever. And I had one of the ones with the battery clip, and I don't have the real Klon. I just have a KTR, which still sounds great.
The teal one, right?
And the teal. Dude, the amount of comments and messages I got about that, like people offering me so much money, and I was just like, yeah, for sure. Just check the date and like April 1st. Oh man.
For those that aren't aware, Brian photoshopped a red KTR and photoshopped it to teal, posted it, and it just went nuts. Sorry, back to you, Brian. You have the battery clip one.
What's funny is this though, real side note about that is I went to Bill's Instagram and I screenshot photos of his posts and I zoomed in really tight and photoshopped the color. So then I saved it and I sent it to people. I was like, oh my gosh, guys, look at this. It's been on their Instagram all along because it shows the date and it shows them posting it. And yeah, I really dug into all that stuff. So that was super fun. But he posted this about changing these things. People are freaking out. People are listing their battery, KTR clip, whatever, on Reverb for like $1,000 or more. And he hadn't even come out with a video yet explaining it. And he just sits down and he has 2 KTRs and a Klon with this like switcher box that he had made, kind of like an ABY kind of switcher box. And he just starts playing and switching through it. And he's like, well, you tell me which is which. And he doesn't tell you. So like loop 1 is not the KTR. It could be the Klon. Like he just had them all sporadically laid out. And everyone in the comments were like, I can't tell the difference. So like I think there's like, there's people that will go, I have to have the original of this. I have to have the original of that. Where like you were just saying, like these reissues are really great. These components, because I had a friend who, I'm not a fuzz person. I think we've talked about this, how I'm just not a fuzz person.
Yeah, you're always pretty clean shaven, I have to say.
I was going to say, peach fuzz maybe?
Oh yeah, peach. Oh yeah, I like peach. The only peach I like are peach milkshakes from Chick-fil-A. But my friend has a fuzz and he's like, yeah, I love how this sounds in the sun.
What? Oh yeah, okay, fair enough.
The heck are you talking about? Because I don't know.
It'd be funny if it was a silicon fuzz though.
Yeah, it actually wasn't affected by heat.
After learning all this, so I was just like, the heck are you talking about? And he started explaining, he goes, yeah, well, when it gets into heat, in the sun, it reacts differently. And I'm like, what? That's a thing? Like you have an unpredictable pedal on your board, because what if you play in nightclubs and you have a fuzz? Like it's gonna sound different. So like
just to bring his own sun lamp.
I guess so.
Yep.
He's got a person just shining a light on it. But it was interesting to see like that kind of, like, people prefer that inconsistency because, and it always comes back to, well, it's what they did back in the day.
They only played in the sun.
Or they only played in this, or whatever. Yeah, I mean, all these festivals and stuff. Like I had one guy, he was like, what do you think wireless is? And you could tell he was trying to trap me into like saying something where he could like catch me on it. I was like, hey, if it's for you, it's for you. He goes, well, if wirelesses were needed to be used, then Jimi Hendrix would have used one. And I was like, okay, well, that was significantly before. I was like, all these things, but it was just like people will always refer to what they used to use back in the day, which back in the day, finding out how some of the stuff was built was crazy. Just like seeing the quality of these amps or these pedals or these guitars or how they were built, it's just interesting. So hearing the argument of vintage and modern, I'm on the same train as you guys. So like when it comes down to it, it's just like, yeah, collect them, buy these pedal shelf things from IKEA or whatever, and display them on your shelf, or play with it at home. But like there's so many good things out there, like having a deluxe memory man with that certain fancy chip in it that are so hard to get is really cool. But like you could get that same effect on, heck, I could get that same effect on my Digitech RP50 that I always refer to. Like I have multiple different delays and I can still get a lot of it's just how you use the gear. You can get a lot of the sounds. Yeah, there are certain distinctions you can't get, but I think a lot of times you can get that tonal sound out of it when you put the time into learning how to use that pedal. Because like Mason said, the tube screamer, the mini tube screamer, it sounded good. maybe the knobs weren't exactly the same, but he was able to tweak it to where he liked it. So I think there's a point to where a lot of these reissues and stuff can become can be usable. It's just a matter of like, if everything at noon is everything, if everything is at noon on my vintage Troop Scream, it doesn't exactly mean everything is going to be exactly at noon on this reissue.
Yeah,
They might have
don't
tweaked
compare
something.
pedals like
Yeah.
that. Don't compare
That's how
pedals
people
where you
do
put,
it.
I know this is how they do it. The only thing you can do that with is like digital pedals. Like those should be the same. But for analog devices, there's going to be a tolerance in those pots. That's depending on the era, it could be plus or minus 10%, could be plus or minus 20%. So yeah, keep that in mind. That when you're when you're saying, yeah, the magic setting on this pedal is gain at 1 o'clock, tone at 1 o'clock, and volume at 11 o'clock. Like it just won't.
Exactly.
It'll work on that one pedal. You take it to another one, and it's going to be slightly different.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think a lot of people even do that, even when like the quad cortex, like they're like, oh man, I've always run a Vox 830 in these exact settings, and then they try to dial the exact same settings up on the quad, and I'm like, well,
not the same
they're
thing.
not
Even
not
on
the
the
same
UA
thing.
stuff. It's pretty different.
Yeah, I'm like, you can't ever. I mean, I have a rule of thumb. I start everything at noon just to kind of get my base, and I kind of learned that when I was at Jackson Ampworks. Is like they designed everything at noon to sound really good, and I've kind of always just stuck to that. Set everything to noon, then tweak. So I never do the okay. Well, my knob was at 1:35 p.m. and my tone knob was at 10 a.m. and whatever. Like they're all different, except like you said, when you get into digital stuff. So
I would say the one last thing I would say here, and then Brian, maybe I'll throw to you for an ad, is I do think as well, this is not a reissue argument, but I do think some of the creative takes on the originals that we now see today, especially if you take the Klon as an example, there's 1,000,001 Klons with tweaks added. I think it's really interesting to see what people come up with, and this may be offensive to most of you, but sometimes maybe people even make improvements on the original. Like I know I've mentioned it many times, but like the Bondi Effects Sick As is a Klon clone, but with a vastly improved active EQ. And so you get more control on the EQ side of things. And I really appreciate that. And I really enjoy that. So you get the Klon sound and then a couple of little extras. And so, tonally, I think this is a good and a bad thing. We are probably in we're spoiled for choice as far as a lot of these pedals go. And so how do you choose and how do you find the right one? Well, maybe sometimes you can start with the original and then you can branch off a little bit and see if people have made some meaningful changes to the original and given you a bit more control or a few more options or whatever and see what stands out to you. So it's interesting seeing all the different takes and improvements that people have made. Sometimes they just make changes for the sake of it and it does nothing for you. But I think sometimes there are some really good adjustments and tweaks that people have done to these original circuits, and you can kind of really gel with them sometimes. Brian, I'll throw it over to you to chat about some of the sponsors that make the podcast possible.
Of course. Thank you so much. Yeah. So our first sponsor are going to be the guys over at the Guitar Sanctuary. I'm real good friends with them. I worked with them for over 6 years, and they are just top-notch, high-quality gear, amps, pedals, guitars on hand. Man, they have over 1,000 pedals on hand, from power supplies to pedals to digital pedals. They have all sorts of stuff, amp capstans, multi-effect unit, quad cortexes. So go check them out. GuitarSanctuary.com. Here, I guess they're in McKinney, Texas, because I'm not in McKinney. But go check them out. Hit up Brian Meter, Shane Frame, Trey Hawkins, Taylor Halpin, Daniel Kirkland. Hit up all those guys. They do on-site repair for luthier stuff, as well as they can custom order all sorts of different guitars. So if you can dream it, they probably can order it. So check them out at GuitarSanctuary.com. Then we got the guys over at Neural DSP, which is excitingly, and I was just looking at the post before this. 1 week ago, they posted that they were in their final beta stages for the new Core OS 3.0, which is really cool. So this will incorporate them, you've been able to take their plugins from the computer stuff and actually load it onto the Quad Cortex. So beginning, hopefully next month, I think they said that they're hoping to be able to roll this out, which will be really exciting. So be sure to stay tuned for that kind of stuff. They have their Quad Cortex now at $16.99. They got their Morgan amp suite. They got the Cortex control, like what I just talked about, which will be updated. And they also have a code. So this might be a great code to have now, especially with the plugin capability that's coming, is code Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, for 30% off, as we say, almost 70% away from free, which is a deal to me. So go use that code, get some plugins, get prepped and get ready for this plugin capability to be able to take all their stuff and throw it onto your Quad Cortex. So you won't be disappointed. High quality stuff. We all have Quad Cortexes, the Chairman and us, and we love it. So go check it out. You won't be disappointed. I'll throw it back to you, Mason.
And is it true, Brian, that if you go over to the Guitar Sanctuary that you can get some barbecue over there at what was it? Hutchins. Is that right?
Hutchins,
How is that barbecue? I texted Brian the other day because I was flying back from LA from a shoot, and the person that was sitting next to me happened to be from McKinney, Texas, and so she was telling me, when you go there, these are the places that you need to go. So she recommended that barbecue place, and then Buc-ee's gas station.
Yes.
A gas station was recommended.
That allegedly has good food. I don't know. Is this true, Brian, or was she?
Oh no, she's for sure truth. The thing is this: so we've been here in Texas for going on 11 years. When we moved here, people were talking about Buc-ee's, and I was like, "Y'all crazy! Like this is crazy! You're talking about a gas station?" Because I grew up in Michigan, so you go in and out gas station real quick, like you ain't sticking around. And this Buc-ee's is like, it is. I think there's 100+ gas pumps. This thing is massive, and
it's like a gas city.
It is kind of like it. Where you walk in, and I kid you not, it's like an entire convenient. It's like not a strip mall, but this thing is massive. Where they have an actual not restaurant, but you can get all sorts of different types of barbecue and stuff cooked up, but they also have this little island area. I swear you guys have to come here next when we do another live podcast. We'll all have to come to Texas, or you guys. And they have an area where they are literally within 30 seconds of each other, cutting up brisket, chopping up brisket, slicing it, putting it in wrapping in these sandwiches, and they have all these different sandwiches of brisket and chicken sandwiches and sauce. It's crazy, you guys. Yeah, between that and the Hutchins barbecue, Texas, it's unreal.
They aren't kidding, man. Everything is bigger in Texas. In Canada, we got 4 pumps and a place to tie up your horse. We are nowhere compared to where you guys are with the gas stations, man. That's impressive. I've never been excited to go to a gas station, but when I come visit, we're going.
Can I share my screen here? Can I share my screen real quick? I know we're getting off topic, but
for those of you listening, you can head over to YouTube and you can see what Brian is about to share.
If Buc-ee's or Hutchins wants to offer a sponsorship, we're not opposed.
All right, I don't know if you can see this.
Oh yeah.
Okay, let's see what we got on screen here.
Oh, so is Buc-ee a beaver?
I gotta find it. Yeah, so it's a beaver. So
are there a lot of beavers in Texas?
I don't exactly
not anymore.
know.
They've all been barbecued.
I guess so. So this is one of them.
Man, it's huge.
But this is even smaller than the one by our house. I think this is another photo. It's I can't zoom in on this for some reason. So this store. This is what I was telling you about.
Yeah, it just looks like a huge grocery store.
Yeah, and they have you can buy clothes and everything is branded their stuff.
Jeez.
It's massive. This place is unreal. So yeah, her recommendation as none of this has anything to do with vintage and modern gear. It's more of the modern day barbecue. But good recommendations. Yeah. Hutchins and all that stuff is really great. So yeah, if you're
maybe we need to do a live event from that area, and we can just say, anyone listening to the podcast, we're gonna be at Buc-ee's from this time. Come
Let's do it.
appreciate Texas. What Texas has to offer with us.
Yeah.
And it's chaotic. It's like Christmas. Like when when you're shopping at Christmas time, it's like that at Buc-ee's all the time.
People are pushing each other
something on
down
sale?
for discount brisket.
Just people are running around and they're getting stuff, and I'm just like, I'm like trying to get out with my IC with my kids. Like, yeah, it's crazy.
Jeez.
But anyway, yes, good recommendations.
All right.
All right.
Cool. Well, she had some good ones. So let's move on to guitars. I think that this is one where I think is equally riddled with controversy. And maybe just kind of sticking with, again, the major food groups here. I think, the Strats, the Tellys, the Les Pauls. This is one where I think maybe there is some merit depending on the brand around the reissue aspect. I think that my argument would be that the Stratocasters and the Tellys are easier guitars to make. I know this may be, there's an argument to be made to say that they're not, but being that they're bolt-on necks, the technology I think is relatively similar in terms of being able. I'm sure they can make it more efficiently now than they could then, but I don't think the replication process is that difficult. You can buy a reissue Fender with nitrocellulose lacquer, and you can even improve upon maybe some of the specifications with larger frets, flatter radiuses on the fretboards, etc. But I think principally, you can get a pretty, especially if you're willing to go, into the custom shop world, you can get a pretty great guitar that's going to be, I think, in many ways more consistent than what you were getting in the 50s and 60s for the most part. I think by the 70s, Strats are not really considered to be of the same quality that they were in previous generations. So I would say, as far as Strats and Tellys are concerned, I think you can get a pretty good guitar, a pretty good instrument from Fender for sure. And as somebody who has played a lot of vintage Fenders and stuff like that, they weren't all great. They were mass-produced instruments, and a lot of the old vintage Fenders that I've played are not great guitars. They're vintage and they're expensive as a consequence of that, but they're not amazing instruments where it's just like, oh my God, this is the best thing that I've ever played. Because especially if it's in, kind of old stock condition, again, it's got the 7 1/4 radius. That's definitely acquired taste, especially now. They've got small frets, which again, also an acquired taste comparatively to most of the stuff that's out now. And they're kind of all over the place. And I've used the analogy that, if Dolores went on a smoke break while the pickup winder was going, you can get a lot of different variations in pickup sounds on a vintage Strat, depending on who is winding it, what day of the week it was, all these different things. So I would say the consistency now of a Fender custom shop is generally going to be better than it ever was in the heyday of Fender. They were all mass-produced guitars. They're still mass-produced guitars, but I would say the tolerances with which they're made is pretty tight. And I think that they generally, I think in the world of Fender, pretty great. I would say in the world of Gibson, I would say it's not as great. I definitely think that there are some major changes that Gibson made as far as the way that the guitars are finished, the type of finish that they use, I think there's a lot of different things that differentiate. The other thing that's weird to me, and I'm sure somebody else who's listening to this maybe can talk to me about this, the headstock is like different on an old Gibson. Like where the logo is placed is different.
Yeah.
Kind of like the shape of the headstock is slightly different. And I don't know if this is like to prevent people from, I don't know, trying to sell them as originals or something like that. But there's like things about them that are like clearly not exactly the same as a real Gibson. Because I have, you can't really see it over here, but I have a 1960 Les Paul Jr. and I have a 68 335. And if I compare those headstock shapes to what's available now, they're different. Even if I'm buying a reissue from the same generation. So it's a little bizarre that those things are different, but I think separately from that, they just, I think that they did things in an attempt to either make it cheaper or modernize it, like not use the hide glue. And I know that they've kind of gone back and forth between using that depending on what era you've purchased. Mm-hmm. But it seems like maybe that's one instrument in a reissue world. And I'm happy to be wrong on this, but when I've played 50s and 60s Les Pauls and 335s, they generally seem better than 50s and 60s Gibsons that are reissues that I've played. And the interesting thing too is in the world of Gibsons, at least, it seems like you can kind of get into a vintage Gibson surprisingly if you're willing to not get a Les Paul for a lot less money relative to like a Fender equivalent. Like for example, a guy that works with us, Gabriel Bergman, he bought, I think, a early to mid 60s 335, for I think under 20 grand. Wow. Which if you bought the equivalent, mid 60s Strat, it maybe you could get like a player grade one for like the high teens, low 20s, but the relative cost of those two instruments at the time was pretty different. A Strat was much cheaper than a 335, and so it seems like there are places where it almost if you're going to get if the idea is just to get a vintage guitar that's something that's kind of like an iconic look, a 335, a Les Paul, a vintage Strat, that you can get some good buys in some of these Gibsons, especially again if you're willing to not get a Les Paul, because the Les Paul is pretty expensive. Even I was looking recently at Les Paul customs from the 70s, just out of curiosity, and a Les Paul custom from like 71 is like in some cases over 20 grand or close to 20 grand. And I was like, wow, this is like 70s. This isn't even like a desirable era of Les Paul. But yeah, I think Gibsons are definitely harder to maybe say that they're all one-to-one, because I think that they tend to make them pretty differently. It seems like there's maybe more of a push to kind of bring them back to their former glory, but it seems like even though it's not technically a reissue, like Heritage is kind of trying to embody more of the kind of the core values of the vintage Gibson thing. Of course, that being the original factory that all the Gibsons were made in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I think that those are probably closer approximations. Like, and I've gone to Chicago Music Exchange where they have a wall full of R7s, R8s, R9s, and R0s, and a wall full of Heritage guitars. And I would say generally, if you're just picking up one-to-one, the Heritage, they're better guitars. They're better set up. They have better appointments. The finishes are really nice. They're lighter weight, all those things. So I don't know. I feel much less confident buying a reissue Gibson than I feel buying a reissue Fender, especially even at the custom shop level. Mm-hmm. But again, I do think though that there are definitely ways, like, and you can see from builders who maybe are not building reissues, but they're building their brand's version of classic instruments like a Strat and Tele, whether you're talking about Tom Anderson or you're talking about John Suhr. These companies, are sort of making the highest quality, attention to detail replicas of Strats with some changes, some of their particular kind of choices as far as the kind of the fit and finish and specs. And those things are amazing. Like they are kind of like beyond what Fender would ever do in terms of the level of attention to detail and stuff like that, and are fairly competitively priced for compared to a custom shop. They don't say Fender on it. So this is another consideration to throw in the mix. What do you guys think?
Well, even just to tag off the back what you just said, even with the Suhr stuff, I've never been unimpressed with the Suhr guitar that's come across my my lap. They are pretty impressive. I was going to ask you, because I have much less experience with anything custom shop Gibson. Is it Murphy Lab? Is that the right? Their custom shop?
Murphy Lab is like another level beyond. Okay. So there's the custom shop, which is I don't think that Tom Murphy has any hand on it. And then the Murphy Lab stuff, I think, is like a custom shop that either he's hand selecting the woods or
Those next level.
he's being delivered, a batch of custom shops, and then he's aging them himself or with his team. And so
Yeah.
you're getting sort of his aesthetic sort of put on whatever that era, that year custom shop Gibson instrument is. And allegedly those are better. I would presume he probably has some sort of pick of, the lightest weight, best looking examples that come out of there, and then does his treatment to it, or maybe it's even more advanced than that, where he's picking the woods and stuff like that, and they're finishing them, or he's finishing them. I don't actually know the arrangement, but they certainly have, they certainly look to be the best examples of what you see coming out there, and they're expensive. I think, some of those Murphys are above 10 grand.
Yeah. And that's where I have zero experience with actually hands-on experience with those instruments. So I'd just be curious, if you were going to go an older Gibson, 70s, 60s, like you were mentioning before, versus a Murphy Lab, as far as if you're going to drop some serious cash, playability-wise, I'd be curious where those sit. But I don't know. I think as far as I'd be concerned, actually playing, and I know, Mason, you own a couple of these things, but actually playing vintage instruments, gigging with it, the risk of it getting stolen at a venue, like I just wouldn't feel comfortable leaving the house with a $20,000 instrument in a day-to-day capacity. Like it would be something I would buy to have, something that has a story attached to it, something that was around before I was born. And I would probably be buying it much more from a collector's point of view than a day-to-day kind of, playing perspective personally, especially when you do have the things like Suhr or some of the higher end Fenders, if you're going down that category. I would be so paranoid. Even just leaving it in my car for half an hour, I would just be paranoid that it would just get stolen, damaged, whatever, to a vintage instrument where you can't just go and fix it and expect it to retain its value. So I think it would, for me, have to be something that stays at home. And then at that point, the playability is less of a concern, and it's more about the instrument itself and what it represents.
You get player grade stuff, dude. Just get player grade stuff. You don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, yeah, I don't have as much of like an insight and opinion on, vintage and all these different types of grades of guitars. It's just, I mean,
if it's Gretsch, you send it back, right? Unless it's Gretsch, I don't want to see it.
Well, I have a Duesenberg now.
Oh, okay, all right.
So you got rid of your Gretsch?
No, I still have my Falcon. I have a couple of different guitars.
Illegal in the Omilion household.
No, I think like I
don't even try to bring a Gretsch to prom.
I just don't find the price tag for a lot of these vintage stuff to be worth it personally, because it's just like little things, and I just wasn't, I just was never one of those like guys that will go drop $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 on a guitar sometimes for this kind of stuff. It's just like, for me, like I get what I need out of the modern day stuff, and like I've had guys like, I paid $9,000 for this and it's amazing. I'm like, wow, like that's great. If that's what it can do, that's what it can do. Like, and that's how, they like it. So I've never had that much of an opinion on it, just because I've never owned vintage stuff to be like, you have to do this. So that's my quick take.
Can you speak, Mason, a bit to, let's say you had a 60 Strat that you played every once in a while.
Yep.
Someone accidentally knocks it off a stand and a tuning head breaks off.
Yeah.
How much value, let's say it's a $20,000 instrument, whatever it is, how much value are you throwing out the window as soon as one component is now replaced with a modern equivalent? You know what I mean? Like how picky are people that it has to be all original, all to spec of, when it came off the factory floor?
Well, if the guitar that happened to was like, pretty pristine and everything about it was original, and that got knocked off, like, it would be a bummer. It would probably devalue it potentially a few $1,000s, or it could be that much.
I know there's a bunch of variables
I
here,
mean,
but-
sometimes what people will do, and it's not cheap, but maybe it's like less than what you would have to discount for that, is they'll buy like a period correct replacement, and you're probably hoping that it's not the low E or the high E because of those have on a Strat or a Tele, like they have a like here's a custom shop. You kind of see how it has this flange. Let me move this so I can have a little bit better view. I'm showing just for the viewer. There's a flange on the bottom and a flange on the very top, but the ones in the middle don't have that.
So it's harder to find replacements for
Well,
the
it's
high and
easier
low.
to find replacements of these because you have 4 picks, whereas if it's the one at the top or the bottom, then those are more specific. Those are more specific parts. So if you have a tuner, go bad. I mean, I would presume in the vintage world, probably people wouldn't be selling them as one piece. You'd probably have to buy a set. Excuse me, but you could probably find something that was like period correct that would be from the same generation, and maybe you'd pay $1,000 for the tuners, but you'd know that would be less than what you'd have to discount for a non-original tuning peg.
Yeah,
I would suspect that that's what somebody would do if they did that, or if that accident happened. And but I mean, with vintage guitars, it's always a crapshoot, man. There's always stuff, that you take the neck off and it's all full of shims and stuff like that. And that's like not an uncommon thing. 'Cause sometimes there's some routing that's under the pick guard when you pull that off. And this is why in the world of like really collectible stuff, like I'm just not into it. Like any of the vintage guitars that I have were all player grade. Like my 335 had like a Bigsby on it that was kind of like, I don't know, replaced with an ABR1 in kind of not a great way, and then I had it fixed.
Player grade meaning there's been modifications or repairs, or it's been used.
Mine had a neck reset, or I had to do the neck reset to it when I got it. It needed frets, which I would have done anyway. But there's just always stuff like that. But I prefer that if you can get a good guitar that's player grade like that, because then those sort of things are not problematic. It's already been taken out of the highest echelon of value. So
you can actually appreciate the instrument.
Yeah, and you can use it. And with the 60 Les Paul Jr., I had a bad headstock break and wasn't repaired. It was repaired stably, but aesthetically not great. And I don't have to be afraid to play that, and in fact, I bought a Music City bridge for it, because the one problem I have with it is it only stays in tune for about a half a song. So I'm hoping that helps with it. And, I've done all the things with the nut and trying to get it, dialed in there, but it's still not a great guitar for stage. Sounds great for rock and roll, but doesn't sound great for being in tune. So hopefully that'll help resolve it. But I want to move on to amps. But before I do, I want to go back to you, Grant, to talk about a few of our sponsors that make the podcast possible.
Awesome. Thanks. So first sponsor I want to tell you guys about is Mono Creators. From soft gig bags to hold your guitar and chuck it on your back if you're going on the subway, to pedal boards and power supplies. We've talked about these guys a little bit on the show, and we are all, I can confidently say, big fans of Mono and what they produce. My biggest takeaway from Mono is whatever comes off the showroom floor, this is apt to what we've been talking about, is it comes off consistently and in high quality fashion. Their stuff lasts for years. And so you just get what you pay for. And so monocreators.com, you're going to find something that you love. You're going to find something that protects your gear. And so you can check them out. There is also a code that you guys can use to bring that 100% price point down to 90% away from free, as Brian mentioned earlier. And that code is going to be Chairmen, CHAIRMEN, at monocreators.com for 10% off. So Chairmen for 10% off at monocreators.com. Also want to tell you guys about another favorite of the podcast, that's BTPA, or Bestronix. These guys sell whatever you need to get your board finished. Accessories, plugs, cable, DC connectors, panel mounts for your pedal train board to make sure you can mount your ins and your outs, and snakes, looms. They do a whole bunch of stuff. We all go to Brad often for one-off parts that are needed for board builds or buying stuff in bulk to just get custom cables and routing, anchors and zip ties, all that stuff done for our boards. So check out btpa.com. Ask for Brad. Tell him the chairman sent you, and use the code DACHAIRS, DACHAIRS, for 10% off at btpa.com. I think I'm done, guys. Those are the sponsors, the ones that make the podcast possible. Mason, I'll talk to you for amps.
Yeah, so let's talk about amps. So this is one where I think things get the most inconsistent in reissues. Stuff like the Deluxe Reverb reissue. I've seen some really interesting videos. Rhett Shull comes to mind, where he compares a hand-wired 64 reissue Fender Deluxe Reverb to a 65 reissue. The primary differences being that the 64 is alleged to be made in the way that the original Fender, black panel mid-60s amp would have been made. And the 65 reissue is aesthetically the same, but uses a PCB, and then they compare them to each other. And there, I believe there are different speakers in them as well. And the conclusion that they make, or that Rhett makes, is that it's clearly the hand wired 64 is better. And I'm sure that was true. But the reality is that neither of those amps, in fact, are anything like an original 1965 Deluxe Reverb. And our friend Lyle over at Psionic Audio has actually done some of these comparisons, and he has even shown inside of the chassis to sort of demonstrate places where there are some pretty critical differences that result in a different sound. And the reissue version, that's the PCB version, although it's not, maybe it's probably one of the better built of all of the Fender reissues in terms of the build quality and the adherence to the original circuit, but is still not the same circuit as the original mid-60s Deluxe Reverb. So you're kind of getting a more production-friendly version that has made some choices to help keep it a little bit more repeatable in terms of its build, and to keep it a little bit easier as far as the manufacturing process is concerned. And then in the 64 reissue, I don't really understand that one at all, because the price point is so high on it. You could just go and buy an original vintage Deluxe Reverb for practically the same price. So to me, it never made any sense to get it. You could certainly get a 70s and convert it to the mid 60s spec, and it would be way better built. Or you could get a later 60s drip edge that would still be the same circuit, and it just would have a different aesthetic. So I think on amps, there's a lot to be desired. Same with the Marshall reissues. They're like not even really the same amp. They're PCB. I think that there may be a hand wired one now, but I think it's sort of the same issue. I think it's like they had the choice to really make it the same, and they didn't. It's bizarre to me that they're making that choice, and then you see a company like Suhr that makes, I think it's called an SL68 or something like that, Super Elite 68, which is basically their interpretation, and that's like pretty much a dead-on like clone. It doesn't no compromise. Or Metropolis does a great replica. I haven't tried the new Friedman one, but I my understanding is that it's like a 50-watt small box Marshall, pretty much, part for part, maybe a few different choices in terms of like how many inputs there are and stuff like that, but really in essence the same thing. It's just funny to me that like these boutique builders are the ones that are willing to go all the way in terms of sort of creating like these part for part reissues that don't say Marshall on them, but Marshall themselves is like not capable of making it. And I don't understand that. Like, I feel like if you're going to put reissue on this thing to the degree that it's possible, why not do it? And then when you see that boutique companies are doing it for the same or less money that are better built than yours, like to me, that just makes no sense.
Especially when Marshall and Fender have the infrastructure to make this happen.
They absolutely do. And so I don't understand. Like I would love to know from their engineering side or from their marketing side or whoever is controlling these decisions, why not just go? Like you're already making an amp. You're like 95% of the way there. Like why are they fumbling the baton in the last 50 meters? They're of the relay race here. I don't understand that because it's like the hard work is done. And so like why not just make it right? I don't think and especially in the hand wired stuff, it's not that hard. Like everything, it's not like you've got this PC board now that you have to deal with or have to remake. They've got the ability to make any changes there. I think that this is similar to like the Vox AC30 reissues. Like they're doing hand wired Vox AC30s. They've got the infrastructure there. Why not just make it like a real AC30? I guess I should temper that to say, why don't you make it with a real AC30 that's like reliable, doesn't have all the quirks, and like that stuff can be brought out of a vintage AC30, and they can be corrected to be pretty close. And again, Lyle at Psionic Audio, I believe, offers this service if you have a hand wired Vox or even some of the PCB Voxes that were from the Korg era, kind of before this, that they can be made right. It's just strange that they just don't decide to make that choice out of the box. And again, you see companies that do it right, like Top Hat is an example, who makes a really high quality AC30. Like why don't they just do that? They could do it, but it's the boutique companies that decide that they're going to be the ones that are going to make it like right or reliable. Also in Marshall, I should mention, Germino does beautiful amps. That are of the kind of quality of the original Marshalls and are beautiful, and also there's another one called, I think it's Reinhardt, that makes a really beautiful Marshall replica that looks not exactly the same as a Marshall, but very much has the sound and the build quality of a vintage Marshall. So anyway, I think that with amps, it's actually one of those things where like all the things are pretty much available to them. Like maybe the same transformers aren't available now as they had back then. But certainly on the scale that Marshall's making, they can afford to make the transformers or have them made for them in the way that they were originally done. And Fender equally. It just seems like I don't understand what's preventing them from getting over the finish line on this. What do you guys say?
I think this is where, from the other two perspectives, guitars and pedals, I would probably flip a bit more to going more towards the vintage side of things. I think for a couple of points, and please disagree with me if I'm missing anything here, guys, but the price jump that you see on guitars, where you might spend $300,000 on a vintage Les Paul, it just doesn't, by and large, doesn't exist on the amp side. The technology as well in amps, we still prefer old technology. So it's not like, and I don't know in depth why. Obviously, there are PC boards for amps, but I don't know. Maybe it's the amount of power that has to be handled on these things, but you see a lot more hand-wired amps and that, like in these days type thing than you would hand-wired pedals. And so technology-wise, I don't think the argument is as easy to make as it was for pedals, that's changed. And price point-wise, I mean, some of the vintage gear, I mean, when we were over there in California, Mason, you were showing me some vintage Fenders that were anywhere from $800 up to $3,000, rather than vintage guitars in similar eras.
Yeah, it's way cheaper to get a vintage
$10,000 to $200,000. It's just not the same ballpark. So buying a vintage amp is much more approachable than buying a vintage guitar in most cases. And that's where, if technology isn't the factor, in a lot of cases the reissues are not made the same, or they just don't sound as good. Like there's a few kind of ingredients here that really kind of point you back to the vintage instrument, and it's harder, I think, to make a case for buying the new reissue. I've played plenty of deluxes. I've gotten great sounds out of hot rod deluxe, cheap Fender amps. I can get them to sound good. But with the price difference being what it is, it's really less of a struggle to make the jump to go to a vintage twin or whatever it is, a Bandmaster, something like that. So I think that's where I would probably go. I would be swinging more towards the vintage for the amp side of things than I would any of the other options we've chatted about today.
I feel like, yes, in like theory, and when you're in a room, the vintage stuff really does sound great. I think all amps can sound great as long as you know how to kind of set them to the way in which you like them to get that punchy tone or whatever tone that you're wanting out of it. I think there's less of a desire, I guess you could say, for a vintage amp when like you get places that they're miking them up in the back room and you're wearing in-ear monitors and like you're not in the room to feel the punchiness of the guitar. And yes, you can hear it, but that warm sound is like, oh man, that you get when you're right in front of a tube amp kind of goes away when you have headphones in and you're playing with a band and you're mixing everything in and the whole stage is silent. Because I play at one place where it's like that. We have a Benson amp and a AC30, and occasionally, and the other guy has a deluxe and an AC30, and they sound really great in the room. And I'll go in the room and I'll get the sound check for each amp that I really like, and then I'll go plug it in, and it will sound pretty decent. But it will never give me like, I cannot go and like spend money on a Dumble, and then go put the Dumble in the back room right there, and like expect like people to be like, holy crap, like that is
for Dumble they would though.
$100,000 tone or however much those are. I mean, I don't know how much they are. They're pretty expensive, right? I think our conversation, it was like the guy, the Tone X, that they had bought one and it was pretty high and expensive. So like something like that, like I could never see myself going and buying a vintage amp that's very high. I could see buying it as like a collector's, have it at my house, have it in a shop space, like to have those different amp tones and stuff. But like if you're playing where you're always going to be miking it and wearing in-ears and stuff, it's just not, it's not, I don't think it's feasible. So I would love to be able to go and collect different amps, 2 rocks, and do all these different amps, and have them in my space, not this space because it's small, but have a space to do all that. But yeah, I think there's just like that real like, do I need this for my current application? Is it logical or reasonable to drop that type of money if, it's going to be in the closet the whole time and mic'd up and I have headphones? But if you're playing out gigging and stuff, I could see more of a reason. But then it also comes down to like, if you're gigging with it constantly, multiple days in a week and stuff, how easy is it to fix if something goes down? How easy can that vintage amp be looked at by a technician? Because I mean, even some amp techs nowadays know how to look at vintage amps and specialize in that, but some techs don't. So they're like, oh yeah, no, I have no idea what I'm looking at or how to fix that. So I think it just kind of comes down to how accessible is it to also be fixed if something goes down.
Does this mean that you don't travel with a full-time amp tech?
I don't. No, I don't.
He keeps one on his person.
How do you get your amp from your guitar to the stage?
Oh, I have to.
Is that why you use a Quad Cortex?
No, I just leave the amp at one of the places.
Okay, so, wow.
Yeah,
Brian,
that's my
you're really
opinion.
slogging it over there. No full-time amp tech. You probably build your own rigs as well.
Some would say that. That's the myth about that one.
No, that's a fair point. It's a fair point. Getting the repairs done. I mean, I think if you are going to be bringing a real tube amp to a gig and you don't have a backup, maybe a Quad Cortex or something that's a model or something like that, you really do have to consider, like, what if this amp goes down? Because tube amps are going to go down at some point. It's not if, it's when. And so having that thought up your sleeve, especially if you're touring, it's a real consideration these days, which is, I think, a cool place to be as well. Let's say with a quad Cortex, if you were touring, and with that being something that could fit in, I'm going to try and fit in some sponsors here, your mono backpack. You could bring your mono backpack after buying your quad Cortex at the Guitar Sanctuary, and you could just model your backline amps. And if anything did happen, which is, I wouldn't say likely, but it's more possible than maybe any other piece of gear you have, then you can just kind of slap that down. But, back in the day, before digital modelers and capturing these amps and all that, you would have to have actual backup amps or an actual amp tech that's there to, quickly try and figure things out. And so it's interesting to think about that stuff. But, I don't know. I think, Mason, I know you have some hot takes on this stuff that we've chatted about before with something like if we take the Deluxe as an example, reissue, the PC board version. So really easy to manufacture for Fender, assumably quite a bit cheaper to manufacture for them. But I know you've mentioned that deciding to go for an amp that's built like that can have some inherent issues with failure rates being higher than if it was hand wired or on a turret board or something like that. Am I representing that fairly, or am I a bit off there?
I think the Deluxe reverb is probably of the Fender reissues is probably the best built one, and that's sort of the irony, is that there's not like a consistency amongst the Fender reissues. Like,
so you can't say if it's on a PC board, it's not good.
No, so like the difference between the Hot Rod DeVille or Deluxe and the Deluxe reverb is pretty different, even though they're both PCB. And there can be things about the PCB that are, again, just going back to the conversation with John Suhr. It's not the method, it's the implementation. There are ways that you can utilize a PCB to help with the efficiency in the price point of the amplifier that doesn't sacrifice quality. But there are generally things that you want to make sure still get hand wired. So like tube sockets, generally the best practice is that those are wired. If you have a primary PCB that's holding the primary parts of the circuit, and then you're wiring off the tube sockets and you're wiring off the heaters as their own kind of hand wired thing. Generally, you don't see a lot of people putting the heaters part, on the PCB. Sometimes you do, but that's a little bit more difficult implementation, more advanced skill in order to make that happen. Mm-hmm. And so generally what you see people do is hand wire off those parts, hand wire off the pots. And I think that also helps in terms of serviceability. So if you do take it somewhere, those are the most common things to fail, the tube sockets, jacks, potentiometers. So they're kind of putting the high risk stuff where it's easy to service, they can easily remove stuff. It's easy to have access to it. Those are, I think, examples of well stuff. Fender kind of does, I think the Deluxe reverb is considered to be one of the better, and this is not just me. I think this is amongst most amp techs, consider them to be kind of the better of the Fender stuff that they do. I think that DeVille is kind of considered like this thing is on borrowed time. It's not a question, as you say, of if, but when there's going to be a failure, and that there's, you'll see issues on their PCBs where stuff gets too hot, it burns the PCB. You can see discoloration from the temperature of certain components on the PCB. It's a huge problem. And the reality is, though, as you said, you can get into a vintage amp for not a lot of money, especially in the Fender variety. If you're willing to go into the 70s, which are not bad amplifiers and easy to convert to 60s amplifiers for very little money, if that's your desire. If you're talking about Bassmans, Showmans, Bandmasters, these are all easy amps to get for the high hundreds, so $800 to maybe $1,200, and they're going to be hand wired. They're going to be well built. You can change the speaker in them and get a slightly more modern sound, which I've done to my Deluxe reverb. Has a Celestion in it. classic lead 80, which is one of my favorite speakers in that amp, or a vintage 30. And they're fantastic, and almost anybody can fix them. Fenders are very easy to work on. It's like a diner that can't do scrambled eggs would be like finding an amp technician that can't work on a Fender. They're very simple. They're very easy to work with, and they can be had for relatively good prices on a used market. So I would say, for almost anybody, I would say if you're looking for a nice clean amp platform that's vintage, look no further than a 70s Fender. They're fantastic amps. They sound great. I'm actually, frankly, I love my deluxe reverb so much. I've been considering getting a 70s one, because there's a couple for sale right now on Craigslist locally to me. They're like all under $2,000. There's like one for $1,700, and I think there's one for like $1,900 that are like 71s to 73s. And those are like incredible amps. You can't find a better built amp than that for that price. You won't. I challenge anybody. Find me a better built amp than an early 70s deluxe reverb that has that classic of a sound for less money. You're just not going to find it. It's just, they're great amps. So I'm a big proponent of the vintage Fenders in particular. They take pedals great, sound amazing, great cleans. What more do you need? I mean, how many hit records are those have been used on between Fender Deluxe Reverb and a Princeton, even the ones from the 70s?
Probably more than 3.
Yeah, probably more than 3.
Yeah.
So probably more.
I think that that's where we can stop for today. Are there any last final finishing thoughts about amplifiers before we wish our listeners well and another great week in tone?
I'm happy. I think out of all the stuff, I just love amps. I love getting new amps. Like if I have extra cash laying around, my first thought is, what amp can I buy? And so I was really happy. I'm really happy to know you, Mason, so you can point me in the right direction on where I should start looking.
Yeah.
No, this is great. I've said everything I have to say, I think, about today, and it was a great conversation. Thanks for hosting us, Mason, today. Brian, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I'm in the same. I think everything we talked about is really well explained. Just do the research. Don't get all hyped up about the hype sometimes. Take the time to assess your situation where you're playing and everything, and ask us if have any questions, because there's a lot of stuff, even stuff I'm still learning about amps. So it's always great to be able to sit down and hear other people's opinions on and thoughts and processes on why they choose certain gear. So no, I'm great. I think everything was great.
All right.
And thanks for hosting as well.
Thank you guys for being here, and thank you listeners and viewers for being here with us. Hopefully you had some insights, and if there was stuff that we overlooked, that we got wrong, or that you have a different opinion on, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. And remember, you can leave us a review on iTunes. We are still #1 in Bangladesh, so shout out to all the people in Bangladesh and Montenegro. And I suspect that those are all rerouted IP addresses, not actually.
We won't get into that,
but I will take it. And if you'd like to leave us a review, I believe our overall rating, I think we have almost 500 reviews at a 4.9 out of 5-star average. I want to continue with that. But we're happy to take a bad review too. We're not immune to feedback, and we like that, and we want to make sure that we're making the show as good as it can be. So we'd love to hear from you, and until next time, we'll see you.
See you guys.
Yeah.